mother was still very active in music after my father passed away. You know, her recording career kind of begins right during that period, 67, 68.
At 59, Coltrane's son confirms the rumors about his legendary father. For years, rumors have surrounded his life, and people have wondered if his family would ever share their side of the story. What secrets has he kept all this time? And why did he stay silent for so long? His words bring curiosity as he finally opens up about the family's musical legacy. Let's dive into the truth he's ready to share.
I was born in a small town called Hamlet in North Carolina in 1926. My family moved from there when I was a few months old to High Point. I was an only child.
Starting in December 1938, Coltrane tragically lost his uncle, grandparents, aunt, and father, all within months of one another, leaving John behind to be raised by his mother and a close cousin. Coltrane himself was barely 12.
Both of my grandfathers were ministers. I grew up in that, and I guess I just accepted it.
The family was devastated emotionally and economically. Having just taken up the clarinet, music became a lifeline of sorts for Coltrane. Coltrane was born on September 23, 1926. He grew up in High Point, North Carolina, and attended William Penn High School,
where segregation had been reimposed. It was a place ready-made for the blues, ready-made for jazz, ready-made for people using their pain to catapult their art.
While in high school, Coltrane played clarinet and alto horn in a community band before switching to the saxophone. Timing had much to do with building Coltrane's musical foundation as well. Being born in 26 meant that by his teenage years, he was hearing the popular songs and sophisticated arrangements at the height of the big band era. The bebop of alto saxophonist Charlie Parker and trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie grabbed the ears of his generation. Johnny Hodges, the longtime alto saxophonist in Duke Ellington's famed orchestra, and Dexter Gordon, the tenor sax-playing, first-generation bebopper, were two of Coltrane's earliest heroes. After graduating from high school, Coltrane and his family moved to Philadelphia, where he got a job at a sugar refinery. A few months later, his mother bought him his first alto saxophone. Coltrane very briefly attended the Ornstein School of Music and continued to study at Granoff Studios. His first professional gigs as a musician, a cocktail lounge trio with piano and guitar. When John Coltrane faced the possibility of being drafted into the U.S. Army during World War II, he took matters into his own hands by joining the Navy instead. This decision, made on August 6, 1945, the same day the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Japan, changed the course of his life and ultimately led him to become one of the world's greatest jazz musicians.
When you hear that recording of him when he's in the Navy, he doesn't play that well. It's not possible to even believe it's Coltrane.
Coltrane trained as a basic seaman at a Navy training station in upstate New York, where he learned the basics of military life. After completing his training, he was sent to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. There he was stationed at a large base called Manana Barracks, which was home to the largest group of African-American servicemen at the time. Coltrane arrived in Hawaii when the war was coming to a close, and the Navy was beginning to let soldiers go as it no longer needed as many men.
After a year in the Navy, I came back to Philadelphia and then went on the road. I accepted work with all kinds of groups, even if I didn't agree with their musical tenets, because I could learn something while I was making a living. They were, in comparison to baseball, like the minor leagues.
At the base, Coltrane's musical talent did not go unnoticed. He was invited to play with a Navy swing band called the Melody Masters. This band was unique because it was all white, and Coltrane was one of the few black musicians allowed to play with them. Because of the Navy's strict segregation rules, Coltrane was brought in as a guest performer, so it wouldn't be too obvious that he was part of the band. He was still assigned other jobs around the base, like working in the kitchen and handling security, but he made time to play with the band whenever he could. By the end of his service, he had even become a leader in the band, showing just how much he had impressed his fellow musicians.
Well, I think that music, being an expression of the human heart or the human of being itself.
While in Hawaii, Coltrane made his first recordings, although they were informal sessions. Playing his alto saxophone, He recorded jazz and bebop tunes with other Navy musicians. These recordings marked the beginning of what would become a remarkable career in music. After he was officially discharged from the Navy and went back to his hometown, Philadelphia, with several military honors, including the American Campaign Medal and the World War II Victory Medal. Back in Philadelphia, Coltrane stepped into a world where jazz music was thriving. Eager to learn and improve, he used the GI Bill to enroll at the Granoff School of Music, where he studied music theory with a well-known guitarist and composer named Dennis Sandol. Sandol became a mentor to Coltrane, helping him understand the technical side of music, and he remained a strong influence on Coltrane until the early 50s. Coltrane also took saxophone lessons from a teacher named Matthew Rastelli, although these lessons ended when his GI Bill funding ran out. After studying and performing in Philadelphia, Coltrane began touring with different bands, first with King Colax, and later with a group led by Jimmy Heath, another talented jazz musician. Jimmy Heath introduced Coltrane to new ideas and styles, inspiring him to switch from alto saxophone to tenor saxophone in 1947. Playing the tenor sax allowed Coltrane to explore different sounds and emotions, further expanding his skills. During this time, Coltrane became inspired by listening to other jazz greats like Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster. He was also deeply influenced by a local pianist named Hassan Ibn Ali, who taught him new ways to think about melody and rhythm. Coltrane's dedication to his craft was intense. He practiced tirelessly, often falling asleep with his saxophone still in his mouth. According to his friend Jimmy Heath, Coltrane would sometimes practice fingering his instrument for hours, even without making any sound, just to master the feel of it.
We are playing in nightclubs where the pimps and hustlers are around, and you go for the hype that, hey man, you take some of this and you'll feel up and good, you feel good, and you go for it and then you're stuck.
However, behind his talent, Coltrane faced a very dark battle with addiction, something that affected many jazz musicians in the 50s. For many, drugs and alcohol were both a part of the jazz lifestyle and a way to cope with the hardships they faced in the music industry. Coltrane's addiction to heroin began in the early 50s, a habit that would stay with him for 6 years when he was trying to make a name for himself. Heroin was widely used among musicians, partly because it was seen as something that could help with creativity. Many believed that drugs could help them relax and feel more connected to the music. But instead of helping, heroin led to serious health problems, addiction, and a loss of control over their lives.
Before Coltrane, Charlie Parker, he was on drugs. He wanted to get off. He didn't quite make it.
Coltrane was playing in organist Jimmy Smith's group when a call came from New York City to audition for trumpeter Miles Davis's band. Despite Coltrane's initial uncertainty, "I am quite ashamed of those early records I made with Miles. Why he picked me, I don't know," he later said. Miles liked what he heard. "After we started playing together for a while, I knew that this guy was a bad," Davis wrote in his autobiography. "He was just the voice I needed on tenor to set off my voice."
Are you really asking me a question like that? How good was that band?
Coltrane joined the famous Miles Davis Quartet, a big achievement in his career. Miles Davis was already a jazz star and one of the best band leaders in the business. Playing with Davis gave Coltrane a bigger stage and helped him grow as an artist. For Coltrane, Miles wasn't just a band leader, he was a teacher. Miles gave Coltrane the space to explore his own style, allowing him the freedom to play in new ways without strict instructions. This open-ended approach was rare, and it let Coltrane find his unique voice on the saxophone.
Well, I think it was probably one of the greatest jazz bands that was ever formed.
However, Coltrane hit a rough patch. His heroin addiction was affecting his performance and appearance. It became clear to Davis that Coltrane could not continue with the band in this condition, so Miles had to let him go. This firing was tough. It was both painful and humiliating for Coltrane, but it ended up being a turning point. Determined to change, Coltrane quit drugs cold turkey. This was also the year that Coltrane's playing style started to change in a big way.
Everybody in the band had their own voice And John was really, really special in that regard, in that you could hear that he was going somewhere, and I think that Miles heard that he was going somewhere.
He began practicing more than ever, developing his famous sheets of sound, a way of playing fast, flowing notes that critics would remember for years to come.
Everybody loved him. I spoke to over 250 people when I did my book, and I couldn't find anybody that said, oh, when he was drunk, he was a terror. They all said, oh, I didn't even know when he was drunk because he was always so sweet, you know. He was that kind of a person, but he was unreliable.
Another major influence that year was his work with Thelonious Monk, a pianist known for his unique and unpredictable style. Working with Monk, Coltrane learned new musical ideas, challenging his skills and teaching him new techniques. Coltrane described Monk as a guide who taught him in every way possible, through listening, learning theory, and improving his playing. By the end of 1957, Coltrane returned to Miles, who was himself exploring new sounds. This reunion came at the perfect time. Miles was moving towards modal jazz, a style that focused on simple open chord structures instead of complex bebop forms. This approach gave musicians more room to improvise without repeating the same patterns. For Coltrane, this freedom felt like a new world opening up, and he took full advantage of it. This style would be showcased on Miles's famous album, Kind of Blue. Coltrane felt excited by this beautiful approach, saying it allowed him to use all the harmonic ideas he'd been developing. By the end of the same year, it was clear that Coltrane was ready to strike out on his own. At age 33, he started playing with his own bands, writing his own music, and building his career independently. Miles supported him by recommending a booking agent and a lawyer who helped Coltrane establish his music publishing company, Call Music. He also signed with a new label, Atlantic Records, which offered him a better contract and more control over his work. Coltrane recorded some of his most memorable albums at Atlantic, including Giant Steps. This album featured songs like Naima and Cousin Mary that are still loved today. He started moving away from traditional jazz, exploring new sounds influenced by avant-garde jazz artists. You see, being kicked out of the Miles Davis Quartet was a turning point for Coltrane. He was forced to face the reality of his addiction and the damage it was doing to his life and career. Feeling lost and ashamed, he knew he had to change. He went through a painful withdrawal process, but managed to get clean without the help of medical treatment or rehab, which were not easily available at the time. Coltrane later described his recovery as a kind of spiritual awakening. After he overcame his addiction, he felt a new sense of purpose. His music began to reflect a deep connection to spirituality and a quest for peace. This change became part of Coltrane's legacy and can be heard in albums like A Love Supreme, which is considered one of his greatest works. His recovery and newfound spirituality gave his music an emotional depth that still touches listeners today.
Clean, spiritual existence that brings together everything that has inspired him from the time he was a child. And so here's John Coltrane at a pivotal point of his life. He's got to make a decision.
Coltrane believed that music was a universal language, something that could connect people from all cultures, backgrounds, and even change the world. This belief led him to study many different kinds of music from around the world, especially Indian music. He thought that by mastering these sounds, a musician could make people feel happiness, sadness, or even healing. Coltrane once said that he wanted to play music that could make it rain or help someone recover from illness. He believed that music had the power to change lives in profound ways.
And under slavery, it was against the law for us to read or write. How will our humanity be expressed creatively, courageously? It's against the law for black people to worship God without white supervision. So what do? You steal away at night.
His spiritual side was so strong that after his death, a group of people in San Francisco began to worship him as a god. This group called themselves the Yardbird Temple, named after another famous musician, Charlie Yardbird Parker. They saw Parker as a kind of John the Baptist figure, preparing the way for Coltrane. Eventually, this group became part of the African Orthodox Church, and Coltrane was no longer seen as a god, but as a saint. Today there is still a church in San Francisco called the Saint, John Coltrane African Orthodox Church, where people worship using Coltrane's music. The church believes that God's spirit can be found in Coltrane's music. The church's leader, Reverend F.W. King, said, "We are Coltrane conscious. God dwells in the musical majesty of his sounds." His fans and followers saw him as more than just a musician. They believed he was someone with a special connection to the divine. Also in the church in San Francisco, Coltrane is one of 90 saints depicted in a large painting called the Dancing Saints Icon. This painting was done by Mark Dukes, a deacon at the Coltrane Church. He also painted other images of Coltrane for the church. In Newark, New Jersey, Coltrane is listed as one of the historical black saints at St. Barnabas Episcopal Church. They even made a case for Coltrane's sainthood, arguing that his life and music had a holy impact on the world. During an interview in 1966, when someone asked Coltrane in Japan what he hoped to be in 5 years, he answered, "A saint." Even though he managed to break free from heroin, many believe that the years of addiction contributed to his early death at just 40 years.
When he looked into the abyss, he decided that he couldn't stay where he was. He was either going to go down and die or go up and become even greater.
When John Coltrane died at a young age, news of his death shocked the jazz community. It felt like a huge loss, not only for his friends and family, but for fans and musicians everywhere. Miles Davis later talked about how hard Coltrane's passing hit everyone. Miles said, "Coltrane's death shocked everyone, took everyone by surprise. I knew he hadn't looked too good and had gained a lot of weight the last time I saw him, but I didn't know he was that sick, or even sick at all. Many people, even those close to Coltrane, didn't know he was so ill." The official reason for Coltrane's death was liver cancer. However, there are still questions about what really happened. His son, Robbie Coltrane, once shared that no autopsy was done after his father's death. This means that no medical experts examined his body to understand exactly what led to his death. Since Coltrane's funeral was held only 4 days after he passed, we may never know the full story. Some of the people who were around him during his last days said he looked very sick and bloated, but the exact cause of his cancer is still a mystery. Some people believe that Coltrane's past struggles with drugs and alcohol may have affected his health. Coltrane struggled with heroin addiction, as earlier mentioned. Many musicians who knew him during those difficult years think the damage he did to his body back then might have led to his cancer. Even though Coltrane had stopped using drugs for about 10 years before he passed away, they wonder if his years of heavy drug use had already caused harm that could not be undone. Others suggested that Coltrane may have been experimenting with LSD, a new drug in the 60s that was known to affect the mind. Coltrane's music took a new, very experimental turn in his last years, and some wondered if he was using this drug to find new musical inspiration. However, there's no strong evidence that LSD causes liver cancer, so this theory doesn't hold much ground. Another theory is that Coltrane might have had hepatitis, a disease that can be caused by sharing needles during drug use. Hepatitis is known to be a cause of liver cancer, and it often shows no symptoms, making it hard to detect. If Coltrane did contract hepatitis during his years of addiction, it could explain why he developed liver cancer later in life.
This is a man who gets his first experiences as fatherhood with me, and I was a handful. Okay.
When it comes to his personal life, John married twice. His first marriage was to a woman named Naima, whose real name was Juanita Grubbs. Naima was a Muslim convert. At the time of their marriage, Naima already had a 5-year-old daughter named Antonia. Later, she would change her name to Sheeta, and Coltrane adopted her as his own child.
I needed some shoes. He walked back from that gig home so he wouldn't spend any of the money so that I could get the shoes the next day. That sacrifice. You work all night and then you walk home so that I can get a pair of shoes. That's father.
John and Naima met through a mutual friend, Steve Davis, in Philadelphia. They fell in love and married. To honor his wife, Coltrane wrote a beautiful love ballad called Naima, which became one of his favorite songs. John and Naima, along with their daughter Sheeta, moved to New York City to start a new chapter in their lives. Their life seemed happy, but things began to change. Coltrane, who was deeply focused on his music and spiritual journey, decided to leave Naima. He moved out of their home without giving her much explanation. Naima, although hurt by the breakup, wasn't surprised. She had sensed that the separation was coming. In an interview, she said that while it was painful, it took her about a year to fully recover from the heartbreak. Despite their separation, Coltrane and Naima remained close friends. Their connection lasted until Coltrane's death. Naima passed away later from a heart attack. After his separation from Naima, Coltrane met a pianist named Alice MacLeod in 1963. They quickly grew close, and Alice became a big part of his life. The two moved in together and had 2 sons before Coltrane's divorce from Naima was finalized. Once the divorce was official, John and Alice got married. Together, they had 3 children. Alice brought a sense of happiness and peace to Coltrane's life, especially since they shared a deep interest in spiritual beliefs, which reflected his spiritual journey. Alice became a key part of Coltrane's musical world, replacing pianist McCoy Tyner in his band. She continued to perform with him until his death. After Coltrane's death, Alice faced a difficult period. She suffered from sleepless nights and even experienced hallucinations. Tragedy struck the family again when her older son died in a car accident at the age of 17. To find peace, she turned to Hinduism and studied under a spiritual teacher. Later, she moved to California and started a spiritual center. Her second son, Ravi, would continue in his parents' legacy by being a jazz musician. Sadly, Alice passed away in 2007, and she is buried next to her husband. John's legacy is felt every time people listen to his powerful saxophone performances. John Coltrane bore an unusual burden. Many experimental artists who radically change their forms of music, and music in general, are so out on the edge and ahead of their time, they elude the public's notice. But Coltrane was responsible for both furthering the cause of free jazz and delivering it to an increasingly mainstream audience, as Lindsay Planer writes at AllMusic. This meant that he achieved the kind of recognition in his short life that most musicians, composers, only dream of, and that his every attempt was heavily scrutinized by critics, a listening public, and record companies not always ready for the most forward-thinking of his ideas. His immense popularity makes Coltrane's accomplishments all the more impressive. While 1959 is often cited as the year that changed jazz with a series of landmark albums, 2 releases by Coltrane in 1960, My Favorite Things and Giant Steps, completely radicalized the form, with repercussions far outside the jazz world. In the latter recording, Coltrane was, in essence, beginning to rewrite the jazz canon with material that would be centered on solos, the 180-degree antithesis of the art form up to that point. These arrangements would create a place for the solo to become infinitely more compelling, culminating in a frenetic performance style that noted jazz journalist Ira Gitler dubbed sheets of sound. The saxophonists' polytonal torrents upend the cordial solos that had begun decaying the genre, turning it into the equivalent of easy listening. There was nothing easy about keeping up with Coltrane. The title track of Giant Steps has become known for a rapid chord progression that cycles through 3 keys, built on an earlier technique known as the Coltrane changes. Improvising over these chords has become a rite of passage for jazz musicians, explains the source, making the tune one of the most revered and feared compositions in jazz history. In his short life, John Coltrane left a lasting impact on music that is still celebrated. He taught us that jazz could be more than just a genre. It could be an expression of deep emotion and creativity. So when you listen to jazz today, remember John Coltrane. His legacy continues to inspire musicians and fans alike, proving that music can change the world in beautiful ways.